Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Dave Howard and Tyson Gabriel again from Premier Risk Management. And we're continuing our series on unmasking the truth. And one of the things we got a request to talk about was, we talk about all the things we're finding, complications in the reports, and some of the data that's being shared. And well, let's just be honest, some of the information is not accurate. So one of the things we got to ask is, okay, so when should we wear a mask, and how should we wear that mask, and what's the proper way to use a mask? So as promised, we're going to get into that subject today. So Tyson, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you walk us through the program.
Sounds good. Thank you, Dave. It's interesting because we have these conversations here in the office a lot when we get these calls from clients, and so we thought we need to share this with everybody, and this is good information because we believe that the messaging has been fragmented, I guess is
less than accurate
with the public. So the first thing I want to talk about is everyone has believed that this is purely a medical response, that this is purely medical science that is going to solve this. And while that is correct, medical science plays a huge role in this, but it's a piece of the pie. There's also exposure sciences. So medical science, essentially what it is, people are pretty familiar with it. It's establishing the diagnosis and prognosis, treatment, and prevention of disease. So virologists, epidemiologists, these would be examples of medical scientists who are involved in this type of scenario. But exposure science, what's different about that is we take that medical science information and we learn how the virus will enter the body, how it affects the body, and then we develop a plan of how to prevent the infection. So we prevent exposure prevention. So the study, basically what we are is we're trying to assess and control the hazards of whatever occupied space to prevent injury or illness, and we also develop a control or series of controls to help minimize those conditions and that exposure for personnel. So industrial hygiene is considered the exposure science that really hasn't been heard from a lot in a lot of the public discourse. So what we want to do is we want to share, because we have that background in our office of industrial hygiene and safety engineering, so we want to share things that pertain to this directly. So COVID-19, essentially the most common means of transportation, or how this is going to be transmitted to other people, is going to be through sneezing, coughing, and possibly talking. It's going to be person-to-person contact. It's not living outside. You're not going to go on a walk and it's going to come get you out of the bushes. It's not very prevalent just and we've also learned too that indirect contact, which would be exposure on surfaces and things of that nature, aren't really a contributing factor to the transmission as we initially thought early on in this, because the virus material is so fragile. It doesn't hold up in ambient conflict to wind and also temperature. But basically when you sneeze, you're producing about 40,000 droplets, and they can travel up to about 27 feet. Coughing, you'll produce about 3,000 droplets, and that can travel up to 19 feet. But talking is interesting. It can travel up to 7 feet, but that's with singing, loud talking, yelling, things of that nature. But normal conversation, it's maybe going a few inches. But the important thing to know is that it takes about 30 minutes of talking to produce the same amount of droplets, 3,000 droplets, as a single cough would. So talking isn't really going to be a significant means of delivery to the virus material for people. Now, when we get into what is considered direct contact or exposure point, the CDC has listed several things. The one that I like to highlight is people who are within 6 feet for longer than 15 minutes during a 24-hour period. So that goes into, if you think through how many droplets are being produced by talking, it takes a considerable amount of time to produce a significant amount of droplets, which is why they have that 15-minute marker in there. I think they're playing it safe by doing that, and actually the WHO recommends within 3 feet, not 6 feet. So you can tell that the recommendation from the CDC is they're trying to reach for excellence in their recommendations. So I really don't have a problem with that. I think that's actually a good thing for people to be cognizant of. But I think what could have the messaging could be better is like the reasoning why. Why are we doing that in those intervals for that in that amount of distance. So, but hopefully that gives a little bit of more understanding to what the recommendation is. And then something that we've also learned through the transmission process, people have heard asymptomatic and symptomatic transmission, but there's one that's being missed. It's pre-symptomatic. All right. So what they've been doing, they've bundled in pre-symptomatic and asymptomatic into the same data class. But what we're finding is that people who are asymptomatic, which are people who had the virus but never developed any symptoms, didn't get sick, they're really not a likely spreader. In fact, they're very low. But the pre-symptomatic people, which are pre-symptomatic, means is that you have the virus, but you're not at your peak level of your symptoms. So you might have like a dry cough, a scratchy throat, things of that nature. So you're carrying the disease, and now you're delivering it through that cough. So even though it's not an infectious, because typically an infectious cough, you're coughing up mucus, but the dry cough could also be a means of delivering the virus material. So what the data is different from country to country, but what I've roughly seen is between 30 to 40% cause of the transmission through pre-symptomatic means. And that usually takes on about 48 hours before full symptoms will surface for the person. And of course, if you're fully symptomatic, you're definitely going to be delivering the virus material. So how we combat this through exposure prevention means is we're looking at this is a long-term scientific methodology called the hierarchy of controls. We've had this for decades. This is nothing new, but essentially you'll see here on the screen the hierarchy of controls. It's a prioritization method to determine what type of controls you should put in place. So the most effective one obviously is elimination, and we see a lot of that with people working remotely, doing virtual meetings, things of that nature. So that's the most optimal type of control, because you're eliminating the hazard from even entering your workspace or your home. Substitution, there's no substitution for this scenario, but an example would be changing out a toxic chemical for a chemical that doesn't have carcinogens in it. But then you look into engineering controls, you're trying to isolate the hazards, so your HVAC systems, UV systems that we've talked about. You've even seen it. Basically what an engineering control is it's put in place by humans, but it doesn't depend on day-to-day human interaction for it to do its job. And so human behavior is 95% of the problem of safety programs failing. So less human behavior, human interaction, the more dependent your control is. So engineering controls are far more dependent than the administrative controls, which are policies, procedures. These are used to change the way people work or interact. So you'll see that through hygiene processes, the social distancing. Those are examples of administrative controls, which are a higher form of control than PPE. Yep. So our PPE, that's your last line of defense. The reason being is that it's dependent on human behavior to use it right, and also for the equipment to operate correctly. An example I have is early on in my career, I had an organization that had the same work being conducted in different parts of the country, had the same exposures, but they used different types of respirators. One division used a certain brand of respirator while the other one used a different brand. It was supposed to achieve the same type of protection, but the brands, they didn't have the same type of quality. So we had one division getting heavy exposure and the other division didn't have any problems. And when we went in and investigated, performed the fit test, we found that the other brand respirator that wasn't working well wasn't achieving a fit or a seal to the face right away, and you had to really fidget it around to make it work. So those are always shortcomings of PPE when you're purely relying on that for your exposure prevention methodology, which is why it's the last line of defense. We don't ever want to. It's never should be the centerpiece of your exposure prevention plan. It's not it's not the special thing that's going to save the day. So, but people are using it, and there's been a lot of discussion of like this is the thing that's going to save us from the pandemic, and it's not. But we want to make sure that while you're using it, though, you want to understand the role, how it works, and proper hygiene. So, one of the things that we've noticed is that the messaging has been face masks and N95s are one and the same. They do the same, but a face mask or a surgical mask has a different function than an N95. An N95 is classified as a respirator. A surgical mask, or a cloth mask, it just covers your face. And examples that are being used are, like I said before, the surgical mask. There are people that have medical conditions that prevent them from wearing a mask. So one of the recommendations that's been allowed by what we've seen in California is people are able to use a face shield with a drop cloth. A regular face shield's not going to stop things from coming underneath, but they're finding that the drop cloth, it has some effectiveness, and so they're allowing that in the workspace for people who can't wear a face mask. And of course, the polycotton has performed well in the Duke research. I really thought that was a good means of looking at what kind of masks work the best, and the polycotton performed well. Also, it's easy upkeep, and you can reuse it, wash it every day, and be able to reuse it. And also, if you ever, I'll show the slide here, you ever get a chance to read the back of a mask box, you'll notice here on this one that I'm showing you, points 1 and 2, the masks are not intended for use in clinical or medical settings where the risk of infection through inhalation exposure is high. And number 2, these masks are not intended for the use in settings where significant exposure to liquid, bodily, or other hazardous fluids may be expected. So they don't serve as a protective piece like has been claimed. I think we showed that in a previous video with our fit test, is that a face mask does not qualify as respiratory protection. And then what's interesting here on point 11 here of this box, the back of this box, is that the product has been authorized by the FDA under the EUA for the use of source controlled by the general public as well as healthcare personnel in healthcare settings to help prevent the spread of infectious or illness during the COVID-19 pandemic. So little mixed messaging there, but really its performance is to quit, or its design is to stop droplets from being expelled by a sick person, not to protect the wearer. And then here's N95. So you'll know that the N95 is a respirator based upon the name of it. The designation of N means it's designed for non-oil environments. The 95 shows that the filter is 95% efficient. So anytime, whether it's an N95, a KN95, or whatever you see, like a R99 or a P100, these are respirators. And that designation, as you can see here on the screen, shows you what it's the work environments that it's designed for, as well as its contaminant efficiency. And then some of the things that I think we're hearing a lot of is how to use your mask, but we're not hearing a lot of hygiene, of like proper hygienic methods to keep your mask from becoming a exposure point for you. The WHO has this handout here, the sheet for people to utilize. And so of course here, you don't want to wear a mask only over the mouth or the nose. You want to make sure you're covering both. Also, don't wear the mask loose on the sides, so like the crisscross of the straps, you want to avoid that. And don't remove your mask to talk to someone. I see a lot of that in the stores. So those are things like especially if you're sick, you want to make sure you're covering those areas where coughing and sneezing can create an exposure point for others. But here's proper hygiene methods with the mask, and this is not getting a lot. And I've even had somebody, actually a few people say, well, healthcare workers have been wearing masks for a long time and they've never gotten sick. And well, the thing to keep in mind is healthcare workers don't wear masks, have not traditionally worn masks all day. They would wear them in certain situations or during certain procedures, but it wasn't a constant. Also, they're trained on how to use it. So like anytime you go to a work environment, that is part of your training, is to get that day-to-day use of your PPE. So the general public not having that scope of training and that comprehension, it leaves a lot, especially for kids wearing masks, it leaves a lot of potential for risk there, especially when you talk about the hygiene. So here they say don't use a mask that's ripped or damp. Well, if a mask is damp, you can cause moisture by breathing, sweating, things of that nature. Becomes a haven for bacteria to build up, for germs to be attracted to, and you're also recirculating your germs, as you're breathing things out. So you want to make sure that when it starts feeling a little sweaty in there and it's not feeling right, get a new one. Also, you don't want to touch the front of the mask because that's where contaminants could be laying. And then you take that off your hand and maybe you get something to eat, and then all of a sudden you've created an exposure for yourself. And also you want to discard them after, especially the surgical masks. They should be discarded after use. They shouldn't be used for days on end or weeks on end, as some people will do. And then when to wear it. So you got to wear, like any PPE, we want to use it for what it's designed for. So the surgical mask was designed for short-term use. It's designed to prevent a sick person's droplets from entering another's breathing area. It's also used to keep areas sterile. So you'll see it in healthcare settings, a dental office, when you're getting your teeth cleaned or dental procedures, they'll wear a mask because they're trying to keep that area sterile and not have droplets expelled into your open mouth. Clean rooms. I've worked in clean rooms and laboratories before where we wore masks to keep the work environment sterile. They should be worn by sick people also when they're coughing and sneezing. So when you go back to the pre-symptomatic stage, what they're finding is that people are exhibiting symptoms of the common cold, and they think, oh, this is my seasonal cold, and they're dry coughing, they're expelling virus material at that point. So if you have that and you need to go in public to get medication, I think it's a good idea, a good recommendation for you to wear a mask in those scenarios. And then also, if you're going to be within 6 feet within 6 feet for longer than 15 minutes of a high-risk person, I think that's a good scenario to wear a mask in. If you go back to the droplet development through talking, the longer you're within that space of a high-risk person, the bigger chance you have to give them a dose amount to get them sick. So these are good situations to wear a mask, and these are good fundamentals, I think, for people to understand and know as they go forward with this pandemic, because it doesn't look like it's ending anytime soon.
It certainly doesn't. So I want to thank everybody for joining us again today, and stay tuned. As we keep telling you, we're going to continue to bring you more facts and more science around everything that the information is being passed out there that we're just not sure about all the time, but we're hoping to clarify some of this for everybody, give you a little bit more foundation. In our next series, I believe we're going to be talking a little bit more about the UV technology.
Yep.
And maybe some cleaning procedures. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Tyson. We'll see you next time.
Take care.